Hello, Joe Yudin here from Touring Israel Luxury Private Tours. Today we have a tour guide who also has a master's degree from Hebrew University in Contemporary Middle Eastern Studies. His name is Amir Mor. Welcome, Amir.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Yeah, nice to see you. We've known each other for a long time. We actually started guiding together. I think it was Birthright Tours.
Yeah. Some 20 years ago.
I think it was 2006, maybe 2005, 2006, something like
maybe
that.
We got to know each other. Maybe earlier. I don't know. I started working originally with Birthright at the very first beginning in 1999, as it's really first started. And then along the way, we kind of bumped into each other.
Right. So maybe it was earlier because I was also guiding Birthright starting in 2000. So yeah, maybe it was earlier. And we've been working together ever since. You're one of our more popular guides. No one's ever had a bad word to say about you. Everyone's always said what an incredible experience they've always had with you. So it's a real pleasure to work with you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, basically pre-state of Israel days, pre-war of independence, post-war of independence, who are the Palestinians, where they come from, and anywhere else the conversation takes us. So where would you like to begin?
First, I would like to, as you said, you introduced me very well. First, it's my big pleasure working with you and with Touring Israel. I think it's the best kind of environment to work with and the most professional touring kind of agency I've been working with. So it's my pleasure. I think a little bit of what's my academic background. Because that's related to what I'm going to to talk about. So as you said, I had my master's degree from the Hebrew University in a very special program. I don't know if it still exists even. It's called the Contemporary Middle Eastern Studies. And the idea was not only to focus on the very long history of the Middle East, which is very fascinating, and I've done a little bit of this on a bachelor's degree, but to focus on the last 200 years, how the Middle East has actually been designed with all the different new players, forces, colonies, etc., superpowers of the time. And that definitely led to the conflicts we're very much familiar with today. So when you first kind of appeared to me and you said, let's do a podcast, I said, okay, that's around the day of independence. Let's do something related to the birth of Israel. And there's nothing more than that background of this very much presence of Israeli-Palestinian conflict up to today to start with. So I think first we have to think of, let's say you and I or whoever would have come to the country, let's say 120 years ago. Who was the ruler of this country? The Ottoman Empire, right? Ottoman Empire, a big empire, have actually ruled the whole region for about 400 years. And if you ask whoever lived here, whether he's Christian...
I just want to interject one thing. When you say, when you come into the country at the time was the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was not a country. It was a district of the Ottoman Empire, correct?
I should say the land and not the country. You'd have come to the land, which we call today the land of Israel, and you would have asked the people, who are you? What's your identity? So everyone would have said, we're citizens of the Ottoman Empire, of what they called at the time Wilayat Dimashq, which is the district of Damascus, the province of Damascus, because it was divided into many different provinces. What was under the umbrella of the province of Damascus? What today we call Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel. Basically, what used to be called Palestine was the southwest part of the province of Damascus under the umbrella of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
So if you had come to the country, Muslim, Christian, Jews who've lived there actually would have come and asked you, who are you? Someone would have come and asked you, who are you? You would have said, I'm a citizen of the Ottoman Empire, of the district of Damascus. Again, put in your mind what's today Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel.
Well, so here, Jono put up the map of the Middle East.
Yeah, of the Middle East.
So basically, the Ottoman Empire was what is today all of Turkey, which extended more into Europe, and Syria, Jordan and Israel together were called Palestine, and even parts.
Exactly, and I'll get there. I mean, later on. I mean, what's the whole division of East Bank, West Bank, Transjordan, Palestine? I mean, and that's part of the confusion, of course. Right. But I think first we have to understand that the whole national identity that we so much use today and so used to today was not existed back then.
Right.
And that's the idea. I mean, I'm a citizen of a big empire. I can be Jewish, I can be Christian, I can be a Muslim, I can be a Baha'i.
Right.
The citizenship was different. It was more kind of imperial perception.
Right. I don't know, but and within those ethnicities and religions you just talked about, if you were, there was a pecking order, there was a caste system. If you were a Muslim, you were higher on the caste system than you were a Christian, and then came the Jew, and then you mentioned the Baha'is, which were at the very bottom of the caste system under the Ottomans.
Of course, and you know, if you go a little bit into Islam and the rights of Jews under the rule of Islam, as long as you live under Muslims, as a Jew, we're considered to be like what they call in Arabic Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, of the Bible, of course, and therefore we have the privilege to live decently as long as it is under Muslim control.
Right.
So Jews have moved, I mean, up to
with the exception of we had to pay a Jew tax, and we had to wear special clothing, and we couldn't land, and we had to not look a Muslim directly in the eye, and things like that.
Of course. I mean, they're all different rules, by the way, in different kind of areas. The rules will be different. Right. But I said decently because you could have lived. Right. And the fact is that after 1948, Jews have lived in Muslim countries relatively, again, I'm not saying perfectly, they're not first class, maybe not even second class citizens, but they live.
And it depended on who the king was, who the ruler was.
The ruler, everyone had his own kind of, sometimes they loved the Jews better, sometimes they hated the Jews.
Right. But you bring up a great point. Before you go more into that, Jews were living in the Middle East in what became the Ottoman Empire, this huge mass of civilization. Jews had been living there for 3,000 years, especially in Iraq, which parts of it were part of the Ottoman Empire, in Syria, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, some of the most ancient Jewish countries in the world, right?
From biblical times. Right. From biblical times, there's no question. I mean, first exile in Assyria and Babylon, I mean, that's all part of the region. And Jews have been living there forever, basically. I mean, from dawn of civilization, sort of speaking.
Right.
But focusing on kind of more modern times, Jews have lived. I mean, if you compare it to I don't know, Europe under Christian rule, with all the Inquisition back in the 15th, 16th century. I mean, if you compare it, Jews have lived better under Muslim control rather than under Christian ones.
Absolutely.
So they've lived here, and again, I mean, you could live here as a Christian, Muslim, Jewish. That's your identity. It's not modern nationalism yet.
Right.
And therefore, you could be, let's say, a Jewish businessman, a trader, whatever, living in the city of Tiberias, and you could have really traded with a guy, Jew, Muslim, or Christian, living in Aleppo, living in Damascus, living in Istanbul. There were no national borders, all under the same empire. And what changed that type of, I wouldn't call it harmony, but that type of day-to-day reality that really worked well for the Ottomans, maybe better for the Muslims, less better for Christians and Jews, but at least they could have really lived. Basically, it's the First World War. That's the main. Of course, before that, the Brits have already entered England, and the British have been involved here before that. But the main change was the First World War. Because what was the major outcome of the First World War? The collapse of the last Muslim empire, which is the Ottoman Empire. That's a huge change. Think of a big empire after 400 years completely lost and collapsed, defeated in the battlefield. Why is this so important? Because if you get into the shoes of the local Arabs of the land of Palestine, they looked around them. Who came instead of those Ottomans? The British, Europeans. The Brits are in. And they come in, the local Arabs look around them and they say to themselves, hey, what's going on here? Those Brits, the British, we have nothing to do with them. We don't speak the same language, culturally, of course. The Europeans, we're Middle Easterns, we have different culture, we don't understand them, they don't understand us, they have different interests, they came for themselves, they don't care for us. They look to the other side, they see not the Jews, but they see the Zionists. Because Zionism started way before. Zionism, active Zionism, started already towards the second half of the 19th century. When we speak of the Zionist immigrations into the country, Jews have actually started to come into the land of Israel, into the land of Palestine, with this vision to have a Jewish state, a Jewish entity, Jewish autonomy. That's already started in the 80s of the 19th century, the Aliyot, as we call it, right? So they look around, and as long as there was a big empire, Muslim empire, those Zionists have not really been a threat. They came, they blended in, they brought technologies, maybe money from Europe, and they helped the rest of the country to get developed.
Right, that's a good point. The early European Zionists, they brought with them doctors and medicine and education and arts. The first, exactly. For instance, the first technical university, similar to MIT or Caltech or something of that, was in the entire Middle East, was the Technion in
exactly.
Built at the turn of the 20th century by Jews, which really enlightened the local communities, both Jewish, Christian, and Muslim alike.
And also, I mean, those people came and they started to bring some better technologies for even the most basic kind of industries, which is agriculture.
Right.
And they provided jobs. Again, as long as there is the protection of the empire, the dream, the vision, the ambition to have a Jewish political entity had not been a threat.
Right. But so when you bring up a couple of good points that I want to talk to you about. So the first one is, so Jews had always been trickling into Israel forever, but mostly from the Middle Eastern world, or the Sephardic world, the Spanish Jews who, after the Inquisition in the 15th century, came through North Africa and found their way back to Israel, and Jews from Yemen and Jews from Iraq and Syria. They always trickled in. So there was always this Middle Eastern Arabic-speaking Jews, okay, who came in, and they fit right in with the Muslim Arabs in Palestine, and they weren't considered a threat. And even when the first Zionists from Europe, and there were also Zionists coming from the Middle East, like Yemen, there was a big Zionist movement, but most of the Zionists were coming from Central and Eastern Europe. They were coming in and they were different, and they didn't bother to learn Arabic, and they were Ashkenazi Jews, European Jews who just wanted to, right, like you said, wanted to build, and they did build. Lots of investment. Lots of arts and farming, collective farms, and science and hospitals. And this actually leads to an economic boom in Palestine. And not only do Jews start to come from all over the world, but Arabs start to come to Palestine.
From Iraq and from Egypt.
Right. Egypt, Iraq.
Related to this, I have to say one more thing. Speaking of the Zionist Aliyot, immigrations in the country started back in the 19th century. Throughout the 19th century only, there were more than 7 major waves of Jews who have immigrated into the country, and they were not Zionist ones.
Right.
When I'm saying Zionist Aliyot immigrations, that's different. The reason some of the European Jews have started to come earlier was basically what we call mostly the emancipation in Europe, when minorities started to get equal rights, as well as the Jews. But if you were a Jew who wanted to basically keep your traditions, your Jewish traditional life, the religious life, you couldn't really blend into the new nation state. You cannot become, you could have been a French, but you had to stick to your own community and keep yourself separated, because all the first of all, Jewish life is definitely, especially religious one, is about the togetherness, but also all the services, a butcher, a circumcision, a yeshiva, a mikveh, ritual bed. I mean, they're all provided by a Jewish community. You needed a community. So that led to, from one side, that hatred. On top of it, all the Industrial Revolution, all the new inventions in Europe, that became a threat for the very, very segregated Jewish life, religious Jewish life, Orthodox Jewish life, because the kids, the youngsters, might have been attracted by all of these new innovations. Well, where to go? Let's go to a more backwards area, more primitive, where all of these developments have not really arrived to. Palestine, together with the dream to return back to the land, the promised land, was one of those destinations. And we can see waves, at least 7 waves of religious Jews have actually immigrated from Europe to Palestine, not with any vision to have a Jewish state. They settled down mostly in the 4 holy cities of the country in order to study Torah and to keep the segregated communities together. And that's the definition or the difference between just Jews coming in. As you say, Jews have always lived in the region and Jews have always had a dream to return back. And those Zionists who started to come from a completely different perspective. So that's about, I mean, really Jews coming in, and the difference of Ashkenazi European Jews moving into that very, very Arab-oriented area.
Right. So the First World War happens, and of course, the Germans, the Ottoman side with the Germans, the Austrian-Hungarians, and the British and the French, and later the United States are on the other side, and the British divide up the Ottoman Empire between themselves. And
the French, and based on their own interest, of course.
Right.
You know, ironically, and as I said before, I mean, that's challenged the local Arabs, because they started to look around and said, who are we? That's the first time they started to ask themselves, who are we?
And what was the answer to that? What was the answer? Was it, we're Palestinians?
So they said to themselves, look, we're the local Arabs of a land named Palestine.
Right.
And that's the first time there was a search for a national identity. Now, we also have to remember that's the time, more or less, I mean, where nation states have already been existed, especially in Europe, but that's the beginning of that period of time.
Right.
And ironically, you can say, and that's what I find very, very funny, that ironically, you can say that the Zionist movement and the arrival of the active Zionist movement into this land, in a way, have led and encouraged what became later on the Palestinian national identity. It's very ironic. I mean, without this challenge, without these kind of Zionists who came in to take our land, they would have never thought of trying to find their own kind of identity, because they've all been part of a big empire. And most of those local Arabs, as you said before, have actually moved in and immigrated in from other Arab countries.
Right. Up until this point, the Arabs of the Middle East wanted one Arabic state. It was called Pan-Arabism.
Pan-Arabism, of course.
And even up until the War of Independence in 47, 48, they didn't want to be called Palestinians. The Jews called themselves Palestinians, but the local Arab says, no, there are no Palestinians. There's only one Arab people, and we're one nation from Morocco to Baghdad. It should be one nation. And the worst thing that could happen in the Pan-Arabic nationalism would be to have a Jewish state right in the middle of that one big
area. The Levant. Now, but this also explains why only in 1921 or 2021 we had the first time riots and pogroms and violence defined like this between Arab and Jews, the pogroms, or those kind of riots, praot, right? pro-Tarpa, like the 1920-21 pogroms. Why? Because for the first time there is a national conflict here between the Zionist Jews and the Arabs, while the Brits are in, but I mean, no one really feels the British or the ones that can actually bridge that gap. But it's again, it's the birth of that local identity among the local Arabs of Palestine. And that's the first time it explains why it's a conflict of 100 years and not of 1,000 years.
Right.
Now,
so the British during World War I, they wanted the Jews, the local Jews of Palestine, to be on their side and fight against the Ottomans. So they issued the Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration, of course. But at the same time, they promised also the French to get part of that area of Damascus, the province of Damascus, because the French were very, very important allies for them. And they promised the Hashemite family, Sharif Hussein at the time from Iraq, to give him some pieces of this land as well. Now, when the Brits said Wilayat Dimash, the province of Damascus, they meant pieces of it.
Right.
Each one of those sides, those players basically said, I don't know, we were promised to get the entire land. And that's led right after the post-war, of course, the Brits, I mean, being in a very, very problematic situation. So first they gave the French. Of course, it's a long story from 1916 and all of this negotiation of Sykes and Picot, etc. But eventually the French got what today we call Syria and Lebanon. So they got Damascus. Sharif Hussein's son, Abdullah, when his father passed away, he wanted to actually fight for his father's pride because his father was promised as well. So he took some of his troops and he started to march towards Damascus because he said, my father was promised to get Damascus.
Right.
And along the way, the Brits stopped him and he said, hey, we don't want to get into any conflict now with the French.
Right.
That's too delicate. We will compensate you and give you what today we call Transjordan. We'll give you that part, east bank of the Jordan River, to be under a British mandate, but eventually it will be your land.
Which was 2/3 of Palestine, correct?
And that's the first time there's a splitting between the west and the east bank of the Jordan River in history. That's 1921, 22.
Right. If we look at this map, Amir, we can see the purple line, and the purple line traces in what is today Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and all of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, exactly.
And that was Palestine. So basically, the British are taking 2/3 of Palestine, everything east of the Jordan River and Dead Sea, and giving it to the Hashemite family who wasn't from that area to appease the king so he doesn't start a war with the French, correct?
Exactly. Now, what's really, again, it's funny because it's so much presents in our contemporary conflicts or geopolitics up to today. Who are those Transjordanians? Now, when you think of it, since it's all one piece of land that has never been split, so the same Arabs who lived in what we call today Palestine, West Bank, or what used to be called Palestine I by the Brits, Palestine I stands for Eretz Israel, or later on the Transjordanian piece of land, the origin is the same origin. Right. It's the same Arabs who've lived it before. Those who started to follow Abdullah became Transjordanians. Those who accidentally found themselves in the eastern bank of the Jordan River became Transjordanians. Those who stayed on the other side became Palestinians. But if you look at the ethnic origin, they're exactly the same Arabs.
Right.
So to say there is a definition, or there is a split or distinguish between Jordanians, Transjordanians, and Palestinians ethnically, that's wrong.
Except for the Hashemite tribe who came in from.
Except for the Hashemite tribe that also came from the outside.
Right.
They are ones who are not locals.
So the Jewish Zionists weren't very happy with that, but they were willing to settle for less. So the Hashemite, the king gets Transjordan, which will later become, after the 6 Day War, just the Kingdom of Jordan. Maybe Jonathan can show us the next map.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to basically, to the partition plan, but they're just, of course, in a second.
Okay.
So basically, the Jews, in the beginning, the Brits were very much on the side of the Jews. I mean, if you look when they represented the Jews in Paris, in Remo conference, whatever, they represented the Zionist vision for a Jewish state. That's been kind of changed throughout the years when they understood, again, the region.
Oil.
And the power and the pan-Arabism, as you called it before, and how the Arabs are basically much stronger in this region. The whole thing has been actually kind of changed, because in the very beginning they said, okay, the Jewish state's supposed to also have what's today part of Lebanon, the whole way to the Litani River, so the Jewish state would have enough fresh water to supply the people who would come in. That changed very, very fast, and then in the 30s we already see the white papers.
So that brings an interesting point, Amir. So the British in the 30s, they build an oil pipeline from Iraq to northern Israel into Haifa, and that becomes a lifeline to Europe of this oil that they can just pick up in the Eastern Mediterranean. And all of a sudden, the British are like, well, maybe we shouldn't leave Palestine so quickly.
It is too important, and therefore we need also the relations with the Arabs, because the origin of the oil is Iraq, Mosul. And by the way, part of the, if you look how they drew the maps or the border lines here in the Middle East, it's all based on their own interest, of course. So the Brits thought of oil, the French thought of oil, the French wanted to have a Christian state within this very, very Arabic Muslim area. This is why they wanted to have Lebanon under their own rule. And suddenly, based on those superpowers' interest, they actually draw lines and make borders, regardless to who live on each side of those borders. And that's part of the major origin of the conflicts we have today in the Middle East. Take a country like Iran. People say Iran is Persian. That's true, but only 50% of the population is Persian. The rest are so many different groups. There are 20 million Azeris living in Iran. A big problem from the Iranians. We're not getting into it, but I'm just saying the fact we have so many different ethnic groups, religious groups, different identities living within the national boundaries of a nation state, being designed by superpowers based on their own interests, that created back then and up to today many of the conflicts we're actually familiar with today in the Middle East.
Right, and a perfect example of that is Iraq, which is a third Sunni, a third Shia, and a third Kurdish. And the Kurds never had their own modern state, and half their population is in northern Iraq, the other half is in Turkey, which is the NATO nation, and that brings all kinds of problems.
So I'm saying, I mean, the fact the lines have been drawn by superpowers based on their own interest, regardless completely to the people, that's a big problem. What I'm getting to is basically how within this land, suddenly both sides, the Arabs and the Jews, realized that the presence of the British here is not good for them. Both sides, except for their own conflict and clashes, realize that as long as the Brits are here, none of the sides would be able to eventually have their own, what they call nation states.
And that really comes to a head on the eve of World War II, when the British are having second thoughts about letting the Jews have their own state, and Jews are trying to get out of Germany and then later the rest of Europe, and the British don't let them in.
They don't let them in, except for there is a secret. Actually, it's a little bit about the Brits, but there is a secret treaty between the Third Reich government and the Zionist movement, and that's 1937-8, towards the beginning of the war. Because if you think of it, the Third Reich at that time and the Zionist movement had the same interest. They wanted the Jews out of Germany, and for the Zionist movement, there was another part of it to bring them into Palestine. The Zionist movement had actually promised to purchase German products in order to allow the Jews not only to leave Germany, but also to come to Palestine.
Right, but it wasn't really their call. It was
a
the British.
little bit of it. If you look at some of the bricks you see in Tel Aviv from the 30s, some of those colorful bricks that were brought from Germany. My grandparents left Germany in 1937. I don't have any documents to prove it, but I know it was really like in a very short time, there was a window of an opportunity that would belong to the Zionist youth movement. I have some feelings that based on some of my studies related to the Holocaust, that maybe they were allowed to live and to come to Palestine in 1937 because of that secret treaty, kind of agreement. But anyways, yeah, I mean, that's the eve of the Second World War gave a second thought to the Brits, of course. I mean, why Balfour Declaration? I mean, the Jews are not really like welcome anywhere. And in spite of all of this, they still didn't let the Jews in, which is...
So leading up to World War II, there was a depression, a Great Depression, and everywhere in the world except for Palestine, which was undergoing this massive building of a nation, according to the Jews anyway, and initially the British. So you have this massive influx, not only of Jews, but of Arabs. For every Jew that comes to live in Palestine, you have 10 Arabs looking for work during this Great Depression, and you have a massive influx of people. And on the eve after the World War II, the British, after the Jews finally say, we want to get rid of the British, they blow up British headquarters, which is the King David Hotel at the time. The British throw their hands up. They say, we're going to leave. They throw the decision to the UN. You guys deal with it. So what happens next?
Now, not only this, we also have to remember the 1936-39 rights of the Arabs. That was another encouragement for the British to understand this is not theirs, right? So they come to the United Nations and said, we want to hand over back the mandate over Palestine to the United Nations. Do with it whatever you want. We know that we're not welcome. It's too much for us. Both sides fight against us. We don't have a solution here.
And the British they're withdrawing from their empire after World War II all over the world.
Exactly. I mean, you can see what happened later. I mean, in India and other places, the Brits started to, Great Britain basically started to shrink.
Right. And it's interesting that Great Britain pulls out of India, and part of India becomes Pakistan. And there's this huge population swap where tens of millions of Muslims go to north to this newly Muslim state of Pakistan, and tens of millions of Hindis come south into India, and this becomes kind of it's not the only place in the world where it happens. It happens in other places throughout the British Empire as well. Yeah,
I mean that's part of that Great Britain vision that again was started to get to its end.
Right.
Here, basically, the United Nations have actually explored this land for about a decade, basically, from 37, 38, and then 40s. And eventually, they got into that kind of agreement or that kind of a map. We know today is the partition plan map. Here is the map. And that, basically, this map was based on what the United Nations called at the time the principle of the majority. Basically, they said, we're going to divide the land based on where we find majority of one of those two people. So wherever we find majority of Jews, that would be part of the Jewish state. Wherever we find majority of Arabs, that would be part of the Arab state. And eventually, they got into this very, very odd map. You can see what the Jews got after 2,000 years living in exile and dreaming and longing to return back to the promised land. We got a strip up north in what we call the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. And then a very tiny connection to the coast, and another sort of a belt along the coast, a strip. If you think of it, it's the shape, the letter N in English. And then the rest of it is just a desert. So basically what we got after 2,000 years is a tiny small piece of land. That's where the Brits claim to have majority of Jews. The desert has not been very much populated. The Zionist movement had managed to make a big show when some of the representatives came over, including Instrom, the Swedish one. They planted roses to look so the Negev would look like very, very kind of colorful. And so he comes back and he says the only ones who would be able to bloom this desert would be the Jews. So that very deserted land was part of that land, but I guess actually it's a desert. We got a tiny piece of land.
Right. I mean,
and then the Arabs got
that strip between Haifa and Jaffa is where 80 at the time, I think 80 or even 90% of the Jews lived, and it was only 10 miles wide.
Exactly. It's 10 miles wide.
And in the middle, you see Jerusalem and Nablus and Bethlehem and Hebron. That's all mountainous. So basically, the Arab state would be looking down at this 10-mile wide Jewish state where most of the Jews were living. I mean, and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, that's ridiculous. I'd never accept that map. But the Jews, by a slim margin, they vote to accept this.
We know that historical day, right? November 29th of 1947. Historical moment for the Jewish people. The first time in 2,000 years, the right of the Jews for an independent political entity had actually been approved by the international communities. It's an historical moment. The descriptions how people went down to the streets to dance and party. My grandparents lived in Tel Aviv at the time. They were partying all night long. November 29th of 1947. And for what? For a tiny small piece of land that in times of any clash would be eliminated in a second.
Right.
But they partied. The next day, November 30th of 1947, a bus filled with 22 passengers left the city of Netanya, which is along the coast north of Tel Aviv, on its way to Jerusalem. 7 o'clock, the bus leaves Netanya. 7:40, drives by the city of Petah Tikva, which is not far from Tel Aviv, east of Tel Aviv. The bus was terrorized. 6 passengers were killed. And in a retrospective, that incident is what really started what we call today the War for Independence or the 1948 war. So you can see there was less than 24 hours to celebrate before a war breaks out.
And that war basically begins, it's a civil war in Palestine. It's a civil war between the Arab population and the Jewish population. Even though the Jews had accepted this partition plan, the local Arabs rejected.
I mean,
they rejected
the partition plan, you know, dividing the land as we saw in the map, left Jerusalem as an international city.
Mm-hmm.
So it would not be Jewish, it would not be Arabs. Something very interesting, you know, in Jerusalem per se, in 1947, there were about 100,000 Jews. You know, the total Jewish population of the country was about 600,000. Mm-hmm. 1/6 of those Jews lived in Jerusalem. If you take the number of Arabs living in Jerusalem, in this same territory, 1947, that was only 60,000.
Right.
So if you wanted to really be, you know, fair and go and follow that principle of the majority, Jerusalem was supposed to be Jewish. But everyone knew.
Even going back to the first Turkish Ottoman census in 1848, there was a Jewish majority, or 50%, with the other 50% being half Christian and half Muslim. There's been a Jewish majority in Jerusalem for at least 200 years.
Exactly. But again, no one wanted to get into that trap, right? You don't want to step on a mine. So what you do, you expand what's called Jerusalem. By this expansion of the territory, you add another 40,000 Arabs. As a side benefit or side effect, also 2,000 Jews. And you come to the United Nations and say, there's about the same number of Arabs and Jews in Jerusalem. That's how it became an international city based on the principle of the majority. Saying that, Ben Gurion at the time said something very, very interesting. He said, Jerusalem can survive and has survived without a Jewish state for 2,000 years. So Jerusalem can survive without a Jewish state. That's true. But a Jewish state will not be existed or cannot be existed without Jerusalem.
Right.
So for him, Jerusalem is a partition plan because he said as long as we have access to that international city, and you can see that border that allows a corridor for the Jews from the coast to Jerusalem. As long as we have the access to Jerusalem, we can live with that very, very problematic map. There is one incident as the war breaks out, and you say it's a civic war, basically. It's a civil war. There's no army, there's no Sahel, there's no IDF, there's no Arab army. So it's basically a civil war between the armed farmers from the Arab side and the underground movements from the Jewish side. There's one incident took place in the midst of January of 1948. This is when Abdelkader al-Husseini, who was the commander of the Arabs in that region, took 200 of his armed farmers, so-called soldiers, and went to an area named Gush Etzion, which is just south of Jerusalem. And there were 4 isolated Jewish communities over there, and he wanted to attack one of them. And he takes these 200, they come to the area. There's a big story, but I mean, we're not getting into the details. The Jews who lived in that community, which is Alon Shvut, they look out, they saw the Arabs coming. They were in the middle of having their lunch because they're not really soldiers, right? They took the guns, started to fight back. Long story, at the end of the day, 100 out of the 200 Arabs were killed. A few were injured. 4 of the Jews were killed. Some were injured as well. Abdelkader al-Husseini gets back to Jerusalem. If I couldn't manage to fight and defeat the Jews in a face-to-face battle inside a territory that's supposed to be part of the Arab state, how am I going to defeat the Jews and to beat the Jews in the bigger Jewish areas?
Right.
Face-to-face battles in Jerusalem, face-to-face battles in the Galilee where they have majority. How can I defeat the Jews? And he basically realized that the only way for him to win this war would be fighting over the roads, the main roads of the country. And this is how in 1948 the most important battlefield turned out to be the road to Jerusalem.
Right.
Because for Ben-Gurion, if there is no Jerusalem, there is no Jewish state, remember?
Right.
And for the Arabs, they understand this is the largest Jewish town. If we prevent supply from getting into that largest Jewish town, and we manage to win in Jerusalem, we'll break the spirit of the Jews. That would be actually the end of it. So both leaders realized that if they win in Jerusalem, they'll win the war. If they lose in Jerusalem, they will lose the war. Kind of going to the same college in a way. And this is how the road to Jerusalem, not Jerusalem itself, but the road to Jerusalem became the main battlefield of that war.
Right, and of course, there's the famous there's a famous book, Cast a Giant Shadow, that became a movie about Mickey Marcus, who was this a professor at West Point and a colonel in the American Army, and he gets the locals, Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Sadeh and some other Jewish Palmach fighters, and they do open the road to Jerusalem, although they weren't able to capture Latrun. And this is basically we're running out of time, Amir, but basically they open the road to Jerusalem by creating the Burma Road and using sandwich trucks, which aren't so helpful.
And then what happened? No, but I think one very, very important thing before I know we're running out of time is May 14th of 1948.
Right.
Be'er is under siege. The Brits were supposed to leave the country.
Right.
May 15th of 1948, the Brits are supposed to. Says this is the window of an opportunity to proclaim for the first time in 2,000 years officially a Jewish state.
Right.
And he does it. And he does it in Tel Aviv, since Jerusalem is under siege.
Right. The Arab nations are all saying, if you declare a state, we're going to invade. And that's what happens. Ben-Gurion, he declares the Jewish state, and the next day the British leave and the Arabs invade. And luckily for us,
and that's the second stage of the war. That's the second stage of the war, where all the underground of 1948 to become the IDF, fighting against 5 Arab countries invading in, and against all means, eventually we managed to win, I guess, on the spirit and believing in the goal of that war. And that's another really part of the story, how we won that war. But that's for probably a different kind of
right.
time.
And I think I'll invite you back. I think I'll invite you back to go to pick it up from there and talk about the War of Independence. But it's interesting, the civil war that began in Palestine.
I just want to say one last thing.
Sure.
I just want to say that when we speak of Ben-Gurion proclaiming a Jewish state, right, what he said, which is always very, very important for me to emphasize, that, and therefore we've gathered here the members of the temporary government and the representatives of the Jewish agency in Tel Aviv, etc. And he says we are establishing not Israel state in the land of Israel to be named the State of Israel. And I think that's very, very important, right, because that's not for Israelis. That's a state for the Jews. Ben-Gurion actually believed that maybe if we had done it a few years earlier, 10 years earlier or 6 years earlier, maybe some of the Jews would have actually escaped to a Jewish state instead of staying in Europe. And he created, in a way, the Jewish 911. But I have to emphasize one thing. Israel was not born or was not established because of the Holocaust, as many people try to think.
Right.
As President Obama said in Egypt, that really pissed all of us off.
Right.
Israel was born, a Jewish state was born in spite of the Holocaust. As right, we said, we started with the Zionist movement, started to be active back in the 19th century. That's already been an active political movement. Right. The idea was to gain majority and to establish a Jewish state. The starting point was 1 Jew for every 9 Arabs in the country. In 1948, the Russia was already 1 Jew for every 2 Arabs. So we've done a lot, huge progress between the beginning of the active Zionist movement to the 40s. Of course, the Holocaust, in a way, triggered the international communities to fasten that process and to recognize the need.
Right. Yeah. One of the biggest misnomers is that the UN created the state of Israel with the partition plan, but the connection that the Jewish people have to this land goes back 4,000 years. There's always been Jews living here since within the 4,000 years, and when there weren't Jews here, there wasn't a large civilization here. Thank you, Amir Mor. Very interesting. We're definitely going to invite you back to talk more about the Israel-Arab conflict and the Palestinians and the War of Independence, and maybe even beyond that. Really appreciate it. A shout out to Jonathan Rose in the background, who's pulling the strings and putting the pictures up. There he is. Thank you, Jono. And people, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Amir Mor, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Hope to see you guys soon back in Israel, touring around and finding your roots from biblical times to contemporary in our beautiful state.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Pleasure. Thank you, Joe.